Welcome back to the VIA podcast, where we explore and discover the American West. I'm Mitty Hicks, and I'm joined by Michelle Donati. Hi, Michelle.
Excited to be here for another episode.
You're going to especially love today's episode. You know, I love national parks, but what about you? What's your experience with national parks?
I have been to many, and there's still so many more I want to go to. So I've scratched Zion and Bryce Canyon, and of course, the Grand Canyon off my list. What about you? Is there one that stands out or is at the top of your travel list?
I feel like you made fun of me in earlier episodes. I think you called me a junior ranger because I have the U.S. National Park passport, which I'm so proud of, by the way.
You are a park ranger,
but
a junior ranger.
But there are some things that are on my bucket list, like Yosemite. Oh. I've done Grand Canyon, but I have not done Yosemite yet.
That is at the very top of my list, too.
Well, we have the perfect person to talk to us about Yosemite.
Lillian Cunningham is the creator and host of the Washington Post podcast Field Trip, which explores the messy past and uncertain future of America's national parks. During her reporting for the show, Lillian had the enviable job of spending a year visiting 5 iconic parks. Sign me up for that job. That sounds amazing. Previously, Lillian was the host of the Post award-winning Presidential, Constitutional, and Moonrise podcasts.
Lillian, you have done it all. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Welcome to the VIA podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on. It's exciting to be here.
Can you talk to us about what sparked your love for national parks?
Sure. So I actually grew up in the middle of Manhattan in a 40-story building. So maybe not the type of person you would think has spent a lot of time in national parks, but when I was young, like middle school age, my parents took me and my sister on a road trip out west, and we went to Yellowstone and Grand Tetons, and it just left such an impression on me, that trip. Really ever since then, even though I was city bound, I just developed this desire to get out into nature and explore. And so as I've gotten older, going to national parks became a huge part of what I love to do.
In your podcast Field Trip, how did you choose which 5 to include, and why specifically did you choose Yosemite to kick off the series?
Yeah, it was so hard to narrow it down to 5. There are 63 national parks, and I literally had like a March Madness style bracket going like on a huge board. And there were a lot of reasons why Yosemite kind of made that final cut. One is California has more national parks than any other state. We felt like we had to have one of our episodes represent one of those major national parks there. Another big reason is that while Yosemite isn't the very first national park, it actually played a really important role in the birth of the national park idea. And given that we wanted to explore the history, the present, and the future of these places, between the role Yosemite had played early on in the formation of the idea of national parks and the fact that Yosemite in a lot of ways is sort of the tip of the spear for national parks wrestling with climate change because of all of the wildfires that they've been seeing, it felt like it was kind of a no-brainer to have Yosemite, make that short list.
That was your first time to Yosemite during Field Trip.
Yeah, it was.
When I think about Yosemite, I think of this big, intimidating place. And I love the outdoors and I love to explore outside and go hiking. But I find Yosemite to be super intimidating. What was your first impression?
Yeah. Yosemite is enormous. And I get why you say intimidating, right? Because it's not just that it's huge, like the elements inside Yosemite are enormous, right? The sequoias get up to 300 feet tall, and Half Dome and El Capitan are like these huge granite monoliths. Everything feels big there, but we had an experience that's maybe different from the average visitors in that we went in November and we arrived like the day of the first big snowfall in Yosemite. So we entered the park and it was just like a silent winter wonderland, like truly magical. Everything just covered in fresh, powdery snow. So it was both grand and enormous, but also there was something kind of like intimate about it. I think like just snow does that, it just kind of like enveloped like a snow blanket entering there. And it was just a magical and very personal, intimate experience.
Take us through some of the sites that you would want to share with our listeners. I know you mentioned the giant sequoias. And so if you're going to Yosemite, what site would you want to visit to get the best experience with these giants?
There are a number of different groves of sequoias within the park, but the one we really focused on and the one most visitors try to get to is called the Mariposa Grove. And it's down toward the south entrance of Yosemite. And this is the largest grove of sequoias within the national park. There are about 500 ancient trees there. And when I say ancient, I mean like some of these are more than 2,000 years old. They're several hundred feet tall. They are, I had never seen a sequoia before, and they are otherworldly. Just to stand up next to a tree that big.
Wow.
And that old. It's hard to wrap your head around it. The park ranger who sort of took us through there pointed out how, some of these trees were around before the birth of Jesus. They were around, through so much of history. These trees have been standing there that whole time. The Mariposa Grove is also a really interesting place and the spot in Yosemite that I really wanted to go first, because the Mariposa Grove itself, I think, really deserves credit as like the birthplace of the national parks idea. And what I mean by that is the Mariposa Grove was the first area within the United States that the US Congress and the president protected and set aside as like land to be protected in perpetuity for the American people. They didn't call it a national park, but it was really the spirit of what would become, our national park system. And that was all the way back in 1864. Abraham Lincoln was president. It was the depths of the Civil War. And the Congress had been getting all these reports back from California about these incredible giant sequoia trees. And they decided to create the Yosemite Grant, which, was an act of Congress that protected this grove of sequoia trees. And that Yosemite Grant to protect the sequoias in the Mariposa Grove then sort of blossomed into the idea of the national parks.
Take us through in Mariposa Grove. What does it smell like? What does it taste like? Because I know you did taste one of the sequoias. Is that right?
Yes. This is the kind of thing that, as a visitor to the park, you should not do. But since we were with the chief ecologist, it was okay. So he did let me try taste a little bit of the sap from the sequoia tree. He offered it to me sort of saying you'll see it's pretty bitter and disgusting tasting. I'll say I didn't think it was that disgusting, but
you're all sure.
Well, it tastes like what you taste are the tannins that are inside the tree. And, tannins are the same thing that are in tea. So to me, it just tasted like a really strongly brewed tea, which I don't know. I don't think that's bad. Sequoias are not cedars, but the scent is a bit like a cedar, kind of like a mix of an oak tree, a cedar tree. There are needles all over the ground. And so there's kind of a blend of a piney, oaky, cedary scent as you walk through the grove. It's like a forest candle. I'm a very strong,
I love that description. Yes.
I would buy that candle. Obviously, these trees are under threat with the environment changing. From your experience, what's the best way to responsibly visit Mariposa Grove?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a question that the Park Service has really been trying to answer, because this is one of many places that sees a ton of visitation, and they're really worried about the damage that could be done. So actually, one of the things the Park Service did recently is completed this huge project that essentially built like a series of boardwalks through the grove so that people wouldn't be trampling on the roots of the sequoia trees, because they noticed that over time, with all the visitors, the root systems of the trees were getting really damaged. So the Park Service itself has taken some efforts to make visitation, more responsible and have less of a negative impact. But I mean, one of the big things as a visitor you can do right is what I did, and you can go at a different time than most people go. So, the summer is really the height of tourist season for Yosemite, but the place is so magical every time of year. And, if you go in November or December, you don't necessarily have it 100% to yourself, but there are so few visitors at that time. And it really helps bring down the congestion in the area. But I think also as a visitor, like, it gives you a really special and different experience rather than being in the crowds of people kind of shuffling past the trees.
Like you said, it gave you felt like this enormous place, but you felt like it was very intimate at the same time. And so I think by utilizing that shoulder season, you can experience it in a different way, which is really, it sounds magical. Just, I mean, everything that you noted, and even just what I love about that episode of Field Trip is I could hear you crunching in that fresh snow. And it was like I was right there with you, and you could feel the sense of intimacy that existed between you and this huge, enormous space. One of the things that we've talked about on this podcast in previous episodes is the way that different parks or different things in the West are named. I couldn't help but notice that some of the sequoias have interesting names. So you have the grizzly giant, which is the oldest sequoia in the grove.
Yeah.
You have the fallen monarch, the bachelor, three graces, the faithful couple. Did you get into any background or research on how these trees were named?
It's so interesting. I did ask that question of this park ranger, Garrett Dickman, who is really our guide through the grove, it's not his official title, but his unofficial title is like protector of the sequoia trees. And what's wild is that in a lot of these cases, like, they don't know a lot of the backstory. The names were sort of passed down and at certain points sort of carved into some little plaques. But for a lot of them, the details are a bit murky. Now, there are some where you see the name and you see the tree and you say, well, that's absolutely the name this tree should have. Like, the grizzly giant is perfectly named. It is both giant and it looks like grizzled, like it has gnarled branches, and it's just like old and rough and really seems like it's been through a lot. And it shows on the tree in really cool ways.
So Mariposa Grove, where else did you visit in Yosemite?
So we started in the south entrance, went to the Mariposa Grove, spent a ton of time there. Then if you follow the road through Yosemite north, eventually you sort of head toward Yosemite Valley. And one of the spots that I still have like a lot of flashes of is a particular vista point called Tunnel View. So you pass through the Wawana Tunnel, kind of carved into the stone mountainside of Yosemite. And you emerge from this tunnel, and there's like a turnout spot where you can park your car, and you get this sweeping, really like first view of Yosemite Valley. And it's a spot, actually, like a particular spot where Ansel Adams took a photograph within Yosemite, and you can see why. I mean, you can see from that spot the rock face of El Capitan. You can see Half Dome in the distance, especially if it's spring. Like, you can see and hear the thundering waterfalls.
Mm-hmm.
You like look down on the green tops of the pine trees and cedar trees and black oak trees. It's like you've just sort of gone through a tunnel and you've emerged into sort of the magic of Yosemite Valley. But that spot tunnel view, I mean, it's become one of the most famous views in Yosemite, in part because of the Ansel Adams photograph, but also because the history of like landscape architecture and national park architecture really started with Yosemite too. Frederick Law Olmsted, who was the landscape architect who designed Central Park, right as he was finishing up work on Central Park, got tapped to create what became known as the Yosemite Report. So it was like a year after the Mariposa Grove was protected. In 1865, Frederick Law Olmsted went out to Yosemite and spent a ton of time studying the environment and really like laying out this vision for what a sort of like designed Yosemite could be, which is funny in a way. You know, we sort of think of national parks as like pure nature, but there's a lot behind the scenes that goes into figuring out both how to move people through the park, right? Like where they've carved roads. But even interestingly, something like tunnel view was very specifically planned out. There's this real focus on kind of strategically creating vista points within the national parks that like maximize like the beauty of the place and allow a visitor to like take in the sort of sweeping wonders.
I can appreciate that.
Really delivering that like wow moment.
Yeah.
Because it sounds like in my mind going through tunnel view, like you go into one side of the tunnel and you come out and you're probably, I imagine I would be like, like
right. It's a gasp
wow,
moment.
but it's creating those wow moments.
And we love those moments.
It is. And that's like, it's not coincidence, right? Like that's all perfectly and very thoughtfully choreographed, that experience. And so actually, I found this interesting too. I mean, some of the work that rangers do within the parks is actually like manicure the trees and the landscape to like preserve certain views. So like if the trees are getting too tall in front of the like tunnel view vista, they have to like cut them down a bit so they can, like, you can still see Half Dome as you come out of the tunnel. You can still see El Capitan. Like, I mean, they obviously can't do that everywhere with a park the size of Yosemite, but in particular places and especially important vistas, they put a lot of care into making sure that those vista points are preserved.
One of the pieces of philosophy that I read that came from Olmsted was that he believed that beauty was not just aesthetic, but it was necessary for public health. And it sounds like while his full vision wasn't executed, that philosophy and intention was executed in certain places of Yosemite. And so we have him to thank for that.
Yeah. I mean, the idea that nature is a public good and access to nature is a pillar of democracy. Like, it's a pretty big idea, but when you think about it, the United States has really embraced that thought, creating these huge national parks, that access to nature is sort of like the right of a citizen, and that a government has like a democratic responsibility to give people access to these places and to protect these places for them.
I know wildfires are a huge threat to Yosemite, especially in recent years. How are they dealing with that?
So that was a big part of what brought me to Yosemite, and a lot of what we spent our time in Yosemite looking into and experiencing. So Yosemite has just been hit so hard in recent years by wildfires, really massive wildfires that in some cases have come close to decimating groves of sequoias. Like these trees that have survived 2,000 years are in many ways looking like they might not survive a couple more decades, just because of how bad the wildfires have gotten. So it's really become, I would say it sounded like from talking to the superintendent of Yosemite, like the number one concern of the Park Service for Yosemite is like protecting Yosemite from wildfire. And one of the ways they're doing that is prescribed burns. So what that means is the Park Service is like intentionally setting fire to certain parts of the park to help clear out dead and fallen trees, thin the forest strategically. They call it like fighting fire with fire, that if you burn things and you burn them in sort of moderate, controlled ways, it actually helps them when, an unwanted, unexpected, huge wildfire rolls through. It gives everything like a better fighting chance because it's not just a tinderbox, right? They've taken dead trees, they've taken dead limbs, they've sort of thinned out the forest floor of the valley and stacked all of this wood into these like enormous pyres. And then they set fire to them to burn it all down. It's a really interesting and important thing to know if you go there and you see this, that this is a good thing. Like what you're seeing is the result of a lot of care and effort the Park Service is putting into trying to keep Yosemite healthy, trying to give it a chance against wildfire. And what's really interesting is sort of like a backstory to all of this is that these sorts of things are actually pretty new for the park, and not just because wildfire has gotten worse and so they've started doing it. But Yosemite actually banned any sort of fire of this kind for a really long time. These were places that Indigenous people lived and called home.
Yeah.
And there was actually a very long history in Yosemite Valley of the tribes who live there doing just this, setting intentional fires within the valley to help keep it healthy. And so for a very long time, the Park Service had really a backwards approach where they thought all fire was bad. They banned fire within the park. And really only within the past couple decades have they done a 180 and realized that, they actually had been doing a lot of damage to the area by not embracing these techniques that Indigenous people had used for a long time in Yosemite Valley. And I think the bigger thing, honestly, to be thinking about as a visitor is Yosemite really has always had summer as its peak season. And that's when they get 4 million visitors a year through Yosemite. And a lot of those people come in the summer months. But increasingly, that's becoming a really hard time to go as a visitor because there's almost inevitably going to be wildfire. In those summer months, that's the worst time for wildfire. So I would say the thing to pay the most attention to before going is what the wildfire situation is there. And that is also something you can find on the Park Service website.
Do you have to reserve a spot before visiting Yosemite?
So you do-ish. It depends on when you go. Yosemite has instituted a reservation system for its peak months. You need a reservation if you're going to go into the park anytime between 5 a.m. and 4 p.m.
So you have to plan early.
The Park Service has also made a couple other options available. So the morning of the day that you want to go, they do release some final reservation slots for day of. But I will warn you, those are like Taylor Swift tickets. Like you need to be on your finger on the mouse.
No buffering allowed.
Yes.
When it comes to, we've talked about, some of the most iconic parts of Yosemite, from the Mariposa Grove to Tuttle View. And we've talked about some of the things that are important to making sure Yosemite stays healthy, the prescribed burns. And there's also a lot of history outside of the park that you can explore through the Yosemite archives. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, this is my little secret-ish tip for visitors.
We won't tell anyone, Lillian, just everyone listening.
Yosemite is one of the few national parks that has its own archives. And they're located in El Portal, which is this teensy tiny town that's like right on the edge of the park. So it's like right by one of the visitor entrances to the park. And El Portal is like a neat little place. It's what used to be the terminus of the old Yosemite Valley Railroad. I mean, you wouldn't even know the archives are there. They're kind of in a warehousey looking building. You access through another building. I mean, if you're like a history nerd or a national park nerd, they're so cool. They have so much stuff, tons of documents about Yosemite's history. They have tons of photographs. Like I saw, original Ansel Adams photos and original photos of Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir there. But they also have like a lot of old stuff. Like they have a pair of Ansel Adams skis there. It's just like a really fantastic grab bag of amazing Yosemite history. And it is all like open to the public. You just need an appointment and you kind of need a reason, something you're going to see, right? A lot of people who do go there are doing research on something.
So I'm just curious, after your experience with the archives and going out with a ranger to Yosemite, again, this national park that I find to be so captivating yet so intimidating, what is kind of the impression, or how has Yosemite changed you since you visited?
I think that going to Yosemite and seeing what I did sort of behind the scenes of the work that's going into protecting these trees, protecting Yosemite Valley, like I think I just go into any national park now with a lot more appreciation and understanding for the amount of work that goes into sort of maintaining these places. Most of my experiences of national parks was like, oh, well, I know there's a visitor center and I know, there are some campsites in here, but like the rest of it, I kind of just thought like, oh, but you're just like out in nature, right? Like what's being worked on by the Park Service is like mostly the infrastructure, and the nature is just the nature. And that's obviously so wrong. I mean, the number of scientists they have on staff, ecologists, like there's so much work that goes into these places that I won't be able to like unsee now, right? But I love that. Like I think it's great to know that when we enter these national parks, that yes, they are wild in many ways, but they are also in many ways sort of show the handiwork, both of the Park Service and of, all the people who came before, who lived in these places and took care of them.
Your passion for nature, adventure, national parks certainly comes through in Field Trip, and I cannot wait to listen to the rest of the episodes.
Thanks. I hope you love all of them.
Lillian, thank you so much for joining us on the VIA podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Coming up on the VIA podcast, stories from AAA members. We'd like to take a moment to say thanks to all those AAA members and future members that are listening to the VIA podcast and have shared their travel stories. One story we've heard from members is how they've been able to use their AAA roadside benefits when traveling as the passenger in a friend's vehicle. That's right. AAA members can use their own AAA membership in someone else's car to receive roadside help. And that, right there, helps explain why AAA is America's membership. So, if you're not yet a member, simply visit AAA.com and check out the membership plans.
Every time we do the mail segment, I always think of Blue's Clues, and I just needed to share that because I'm like, we just got a letter. Sorry.
Oh, no, it's great.
It's time to hear from AAA members.
I wonder what we're going to learn today.
We have a self-proclaimed globetrotter, Elaine Lee. She has visited 69 countries, but says there is always one place that consistently makes the top 10 list, and that is Yosemite National Park. Elaine writes, I have been visiting there regularly for 2 decades, and its majesty and magic have never lost their luster. One of Yosemite's best-kept secrets is the Redwoods, which consists of 120 unique cabins, from cozy one-bedrooms to luxury abodes, in the small town of Wawona, located near the south gate of the park, 27 miles from the valley. The homes can accommodate between 2 and 14 people and are mostly dog-friendly. The town has a market, library, gas station, and ranger station. It was our first visit, but it won't be the last.
Okay, so Michelle, you're looking for somewhere to go this summer. I know you don't like to camp, but keyword luxury, cozy abodes there. This sounds like a recipe for the best national park trip ever.
You had me at luxury abode. And just like our guest, AAA member Andre Cahill of California thinks Yosemite is an absolute beauty with mountains, lakes, and waterfall, and he's been there many times. He writes that the park has a couple of lodges and a great place to camp or just visit.
I'm really interested in the waterfall portion. I think I told you about a trip I took with my partner to Oregon and just really loving the waterfalls, almost bringing me to tears. So that sounds amazing.
And one of the things I've learned about traveling as a mom with 3 kids is that if you want to make your kids, especially my kids, excited about hiking or doing something that they've never done before, have it be a waterfall, have it be some sort of water feature. That is something that's going to capture them and just hook them in from the get. Like, we're hiking to this waterfall or we're hiking to this lake. Water is the secret ingredient.
Oh, for sure.
Love your comments, questions, and especially your stories about travel in the West. Send us an email at viamail@viamagazine.com. Again, that email is viamagazine.com. You can also leave us a voicemail at 415-475-9350. Again, that phone number is 415-475-9350.
And don't be shy. You may hear your voicemail played on the podcast.
The VIA podcast is hosted by Mitty Hicks and Michelle Donati. That's me.
Produced by Whitney Fanoof, editor-in-chief of VIA, Katie Henry, managing editor of VIA, and editorial consultant April Kilcrease, alongside Dave Beasing and Jason Jackson of Sound That Brands.
Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to follow and subscribe to the VIA podcast. That way, you'll never miss an episode. Discover more places to travel in the West at AAA.com/VIA. VIA Magazine is published by AAA Mountain West Group.
The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of AAA Mountain West Group or its personnel.